So, good evening everybody, again. Welcome to our first, and I hope first of several more, Sanshin Salon. So today we are taking up the topic of our storytelling tradition, right? Transmitting tales and telling tales within our particular Soto Zen tradition, but also in order to talk about that, we have to talk about a much broader picture, right? We don't get to talk about talk about our storytelling tradition too much, but this is one of those opportunities, I think, to expand our view of how our practice is influenced, where references come from, plus, heck, stories are fun, right? So we have two very interesting people with us, just from the broader community. These are not people you're going to see in our Zendo every day, although they've both been to Sanshin and been engaged with us in various ways. So next to me here I have Ryo. He is now tell me, folklore. What's your topic?
Religious studies, but also folklore.
Religious studies and folklore, graduate student at IU, right? So, as someone with direct experience of Japanese culture, he's got a very particular take on stories and folklore within this tradition. Next to him we have Michael. Michael comes to us in large part from a project called Interior Mythist Journeys. So Michael and his daughter have been to Sanshin, 4 or 5 times now to do interviews with Todo-san, and those are available on the Interior Mythist Journeys website, along with curricula and resources and many other things about exploring spiritual journeys, meaning of whatever we're doing, meaning of life, right? So we have two interesting perspectives that are not coming directly out of this kind of Zazen ritual, work study kind of framework. So I think that really gives us an opportunity to think broadly, right? To expand our view. So I'm going to start this conversation, but about a half an hour we're going to throw it open to everybody. And please participate. This is not, as I say, an academic presentation. So reflections, questions, what strikes you, right? Interspersed with that, we're going to have Doju reading some actual examples of some of the vernacular stories that we're talking about. So I've given him 3 collections of stories. One's about the Lotus Sutra, one's about Jizo, one's about Kanon, Avalokiteshvara, and said, please choose a story from each of these to share with us so we can actually hear stories and take them apart a little bit and see how we feel about them and how we respond to them. So we have lots of interesting things to talk about, right? I want to start with Michael, and I want to ask you about a theme that we see that's really central in your project and that we see on your website, which is, we need a new story today. There is something about whatever is happening in the world and just change over time, which says, as human beings, somehow we need a new story today. So what does that mean, and how do we get to a new story?
Good question. Let me give you the answer. In 1949, a guy named Joseph Campbell announced that we were in the time between the myths, and that this was the defining reality of our moment in history. And I'm certain you've all read a lot about this in the New York Times and wherever else. No. This is, even though it's the defining reality of our moment in history, it's not something that is recognized, not something that is appreciated, and what he basically said was that we live in the time between the myths, and that is to say that the old myth, the old story, is for the most part dead, gone, impotent, not communicating with the depth of humanity. And if that weren't enough, the new story has not arrived. And the defining reality is that we live here between this old story that doesn't work and this new story that hasn't shown up. And of course, within all of this, and when when I talk about myth and story, I'm probably not going to be you fall asleep quickly if I start telling stories. I won't. We're going to leave that to someone else. But what we have to understand is that story, and you can even think about that in terms of itsy little myths, such as we encounter in language or poetry or whatever. But that this is where we contain our most fundamental relationships to life. Whether we're conscious of it or not, we have a story about our relationship to our spouse, to our dog, to our job, to what's happening in Minneapolis, to what's happening in Washington. We have stories. And within those stories, we hold our relationships. The same has been true throughout history in regards to the deep things of life. And what we have to understand is that what I talk about is the supporting myth, the old myth. And whether we're talking about the old myth of Buddhism or Christianity or whatever else, most of these, the language that supports these stories, this language evolved from a scientific worldview that's about 25,000 years old. In other words, when we were sitting around the campfire doing what we did 25,000 years ago, we looked up and saw, this was clear, that there were holes in that next level, and light was leaking through. But everybody was clear that it was a multi-story universe. And this was not some religious expression. This wasn't some tribal voodoo. No, this was the science of the day. We human beings and our cognitive capabilities, it was obvious that it was a multi-story universe. And our language evolved out of that. In the East, in the West, that's where our language evolved. And so the way whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, or whatever else, most of these frameworks for connecting with the deep things of humanity were framed within a language which evolved from a science that's 25,000 years old, multi-story. But that's not the world we live in. And what is true now is that we live in a global society. We live in a quantum scientific universe. I mean, every kid has one of those little phones in their pocket, and they know that my granddaughter can text her friends anywhere in the world and share videos and whatever else, and they know that it's all connected. Again, this was not a religious statement. This is of course, we live in a quantum scientific universe, and everybody out there knows that we live in a sea of energy, and that it's all connected. Yet, our religious institutions are still forcing us and forcing my granddaughter to try to go back to language that totally does not connect, poetry that totally does not connect, in order to explain how she can connect with the depth of her life. So we have a little challenge. That's probably more than enough to start.
So that's an interesting way to start the conversation in a room full of people who, who practice a 2,500-year-old tradition, right? So that's interesting. So as you look at folklore and religion and sort of the intersection of that, how do you think stories, I mean historically and today, how do you think stories are helping people to connect with their history, with each other? And Michael's just made the point that stories are really about connecting with something, right? So how do you see the role of stories, connecting people with their tradition, with their past, with each other, and maybe how you've seen that shift over time?
Yeah.
Friendly group.
Yeah. Yep. So I feel like stories are told like not only to entertain us, because I think stories, maybe sometimes scary stories, but most of the time funny stories, indie stories are very fun and very entertaining to listen to, watch to, and also speaking the stories. And these stories I feel like are like a bit or mnemonics of how past traditions are continued from the past and to the present, and it's like a window to the past, and how they view, like Michael said, the science of those days. One example that I can think about is a yokai. Yokai is a Japanese monsters or Japanese goblin.
Ghost story.
Those, yeah. And one of those yokai is called the Azuki-arai, which literally translates to the red bean cleaner, which they're like these small goblins, like but then like while making those noises and with that distinct loud noises, and back then people thought that those creatures existed, these red bean cleaners, but then in fact, like if we dissect those stories, it was more like their science, their way of explaining that, oh, those are not the sounds of actual creatures, but in fact just a natural phenomenon where a river or a pebble within the river are just clanging into each other, making that distinct, rattling, bean cleaning like noises. So these stories, as entertaining as it is, have some form of science in it that I think is just well worth learning, and possibly learn that these people, despite some people who is focused on science, despite them considering that to be little like superstitiously or a little bit too spiritual, they do have a way of explaining science. It's a science in their own terms, and I'm just adding on like to the point that I forgot what was the question. What was the question?
So I think one of the interesting threads that comes out of this is that stories sort of help us make sense of our world, right? And we're often dealing, especially in a spiritual practice, with things which are intangible, like sound or like an emotional experience, or we've been told something by our tradition. We've been told something is true. We can't see it. Maybe we experience it in a certain way, right? But it feels like stories sort of help us connect with those things, make sense of our world, explain maybe things that we experience, right? So I want to pitch to Doju and have him give us the first example of the story. And I don't know, I've not read these in a long time, so it's going to be a surprise for me as well as for you. Ask him to share the first story in his list so that we get some sense of how these stories in the Japanese Buddhist tradition help us connect with the tradition, and also perhaps just to explain things that we've heard, stories and things we've heard, things we've seen, right? Again, recognizing these stories are very, very old, so the science of that day was quite different. You want to choose something and share with us?
Trying to decide which one is the most scientific.
Oh, well, that's any of them is all right.
And I think I have a good one.
Okay, good.
So this one is from Miraculous Tales of the Lotus Sutra.
So before you, let me just be clear. This is not stories that are taken from the Lotus Sutra. This is a collection of stories about the Lotus Sutra. You will not find this in the Lotus Sutra itself.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, and just to maybe give a little further background too about this sort of genre of storytelling, at this time. So most of these date from over 1,000 years ago or thereabouts in Japan, and have precedents from even before then in China, and sometimes all the way back to India. So these were tales meant to sort of spread Buddhist teachings to people who weren't, priests or necessarily literate. So a way of common folk to sort of learn Buddhist tenets, essentially. Okay, so this one is called About Priest Jinyu of Echigo Province. Priest Jinyu, commonly called Sho Daitoku of Koshi, had many names which need not be mentioned here. He was of the Koshi district of Echigo Province. He recited the Hokei-kyo, that's the Lotus Sutra, and was devoted to his incomparably strict ascetic practice. Demon deities obeyed his order. The lord of the region revered him from afar, and all those in the vicinity paid homage to him. Now, there was a mountain called Mount Kukami in that province, and wishing to do some good deed, a pious patron built a jeweled pagoda there. When he was about to perform a service of dedication for the pagoda, the thunder rolled and lightning struck and shattered the building. The sad patron grieved and lamented tearfully. He reconstructed the pagoda, but when he tried to offer the dedicatory service for it, just as before, the thunder rolled down with lightning and broke it into rubble. His pagoda was destroyed in this way 3 times. The patron grieved over his unaccomplished vow. He desired once more to reconstruct the pagoda and wished it to be safe from the thunder's destruction. Priest Jinyu told the devout man, "Don't lament any longer. With the power of the Hokei-kyo, I will protect the pagoda from destruction, so that you may fulfill your vow." Priest Jinyu stayed at the foot of the newly built pagoda and recited the sutra. Suddenly the thunder began to roll through the clouds, a light rain fell, and lightning flashed. The devotee once more grieved, for he was afraid that that this was a sign that the thunder was trying to destroy the pagoda. Priest Jinyu made a vow and continuously recited the sutra in a loud voice. At that moment, a boy fell from the sky. He seemed to be about 15 or 16 years old. He had unkempt hair and a furious look. He was bound in 5 places, including his body, knees, and head, and he cried loudly and tearfully. Bowing and prostrating himself before Jinyu, the boy said, "Have mercy and forgive me. I will never destroy the pagoda hereafter." When Jinyu asked him why he had destroyed the pagoda, the boy replied, "The earth deity of the mountain is a close friend of mine. The deity told me, 'A pagoda has been built on top of me and I have lost my place. Destroy the pagoda.' So I have destroyed the pagoda each time for the deity. However, the mysterious power of the sutra has subjugated everything and the earth deity has moved elsewhere. I am also frightened and awestruck by such power as this." The patron now realized that his vow had been fulfilled and the priest's words were true. Priest Jinyu said to the boy, the incarnation of the thunder, "Since you follow the dharma of the Buddha and do nothing contrary to it, and are also developing a good mind without destroying the pagoda, you will be truly benefited by your virtue. Now, when I look at the temple here, I see that it has no water. The priests have to go down to the valley and climb up here to fetch water. You, thunder, must cause a spring to appear at this temple for the sake of the resident priests. If you don't create the spring, I will bind you and won't release you for months and even years. Also, you must not make any rolling noise within 40 ri of the 4 directions about this temple." The prostrated thunder respectfully received the priest's orders and said, "I will produce the water as you said. Moreover, how could I dare make any rolling noise or even appear within 40 ri about this mountain?" The thunder then poured a few drops of water from a container onto his palms. As soon as he had made a hole on top of the rock with his fingers, the thunder made a quick movement and leaped up into the sky and disappeared. Clear and abundant water suddenly gushed from the hole in the rock. It was cold in summer to reduce the heat and warm in winter to prevent freezing. The jeweled pagoda remained undamaged for several hundred years. Although the thunder rolled in all other places, it was never heard within 40 ri in the 4 directions of Mount Kukami. Truly, the power of the Dharma is unusual and mysterious. Many priests gathered there and lived in the temple. They propagated the dharma and benefited others. Owing to the power of the Hokekyo, priest Jinyu displayed marvelous virtue to the people and attained awakening. He expired during the era of Jingo Keun.
All right, very good. So I think that story is a really important illustration of one of the ways that these stories get used. And one of the interesting things about these stories is that we often see them, there are very similar versions that will appear tied to very particular places or temples, and it's often because those stories are used to legitimize something. So if we look at all the ways in this story that Doju just read, the things got legitimized, right? The Dharma, the Sutra, the particular priest that was performing the action, the sacredness of that piece of ground, right? I wonder what you two, and please feel free to leap in, kind of on each other, what you two have encountered or would like to say about this use of stories to illustrate how powerful something is, or to give that impression, right? That something is, because of course there's lots of reasons you would want to do that.
Although this is not like the particular example that I'm about to give, it's not really from the Lotus Sutta, but instead of the Heart Sutta. In one of the seminars that I took last year, we as a class visited the Lilly Library in the Bloomington Library and the Bloomington campus, and I come across a Heart Sutta, but it's not in written in sort of letters, but instead it was in pictures. So there are many word plays, a vernacular kind of way of reciting the suttas for the reader, for the people who cannot read any letters, for what we call the common people. And the story that Doju gave us has a similar kind of connotation where these are impactful stories. As I said, a storytelling mnemonic to remember that the Lotus Sutta, the Heart Sutta is easily cited, easily remembered, and could be given to all for the sake of salvation for all the people who's reciting or possibly copying the sutta or possibly the story. So again, this visual mnemonic got to me.
Because that really was important, because as you mentioned, of course, these are not folks who are going to go down to the local library, go online and read, the sutras or the commentaries or the sort of academic discussion of these things, right? The way that Dharma got transmitted was through stories like this. So often these stories were used by clergy who were giving sermons, right? Sometimes it was all about pictures. There were people who just who did their preaching by holding up a picture and explaining the picture, right? These are very much aimed at non-academic, non-clergy people, and also, I just lost my train of thought. So anyway, there is something that's really important about that says this is a way for common people to encounter Dharma, and if these stories feel like they are illustrating something important, there is some legitimacy there, right? Clearly, this is a powerful practice. We should support it, or at least not get in its way. We should go to support a particular temple in a very powerful place, right? So I felt that a lot with these kind of tales. Does that show up in other sort of spiritual traditions where stories are used in that way? Because we know, there's tales told about Dogen for the same reasons, right? The whole Dogen branding thing, there's a lot of stories about him, which, okay, they're apocryphal, but they make him seem powerful. We sort of do that as humans, don't we?
Yeah, of course, this is just, if I were going to spend some time with that story, the filter I would be using is, what is the relationship to life that this story is attempting to communicate? What is the posture towards life that this story is advocating? And it's there, whether it's the asceticism and the ritual practice of this particular priest or whatever. You know, and all I could think about when you were reading that was we had my son over for dinner last night. He's 39 years old. And anyway, he is suddenly obsessed with what's that new video game he's into?
Oh, I can't tell you, but
Okay,
it
anyway.
has to do with horses and
It
Capturing
sounds really
people and-
exciting. He's captured by it.
it's an older video game, but I don't know video games.
Anyway.
Red something
Well,
rather.
the point is this.
That might be it. Does it have horses?
It does have
Okay.
Yeah. What was the name of it?
Red Dead Redemption 2.
You got it. That's it.
Your work here is done.
You talk about something that communicates,
Yeah.
all right? It communicates. Now, what it communicates is another question, but nonetheless, human beings communicate through stories. That's what we do. And, you know, and it's not the case, and Andy and I were discussing this, but it's not the case that mythology is something that happened, you know, back with the Greeks and no. The greatest mythological force in history is something called Hollywood. And of course, young people today are eating this up with video games and whatever. And Sony's making a fortune. And you know, and we're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we get a hold of that in relationship to communicating how to be a human being of depth today? That's the question. What are the stories? How does that get out there?
Yeah.
What's the messaging that makes that happen?
Because it's interesting, this story still speaks to us, right? I mean, we wouldn't be interested in it, we wouldn't find it entertaining or interesting if there wasn't something still in this story 1,000 years old.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, it says we want to believe that something is powerful, or we want to believe that our spiritual practice is meaningful, or, right? So we'd like to hear examples of that just to reinforce our commitment in some way, right?
Yeah.
So I have a sort of
Please.
a question that came up for me reading this, for both of you. Ryo, you mentioned yokai, and I think what's really interesting about that, and sort of related to video games, because yokai are sort of more popular than ever, you know, in contemporary Japan, but also in the U.S. through the profusion of Japanese culture here. And so in some sense, there's kind of a dialogue with the old myth and the new myth, right? And in this story, we see that happening kind of too, because there's, you know, the subtext here is there's a Buddhist Shinto rivalry going on. The thunder god and the earth deity are both Shinto gods from the old myth at that time, and they're trying to show that actually Buddhism is more powerful and is able to subjugate those forces. So in some sense, that maybe is part of this process, right, of the old myth and the new myth kind of duking it out, even though the new myth isn't quite here yet. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, maybe starting with you, Ryo, like maybe what you think about yokai in that context, like how it speaks to modern people versus old people, and then also, you know, maybe what you think about how that fits into Joseph Campbell's model. So,
I'm not too I'm not gorging myself too much on like modern interpretation of yokais, but many a time like when very special meaning like anything like significant world event happens, like oftentimes yokai comes to be incorporated. More recent example is during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were many people, you know, being confined to their own place, and one of the yokai that spawned up is this yokai called the Amabie, which is although I have to say, a poorly drawn official picture of what amabie look like. It's a basically a fish body, but with a human face, a human head with a bird-like beak. It's a very funky looking creature. This amabie is able to predict misfortunes, and this misfortune is in the form of COVID-19. And because they fish out this older text that contain this amabie creature, or many of the or other catastrophe predicting creatures, they start to post it online through Twitter or X nowadays, or they start to worship it as some form of deity. And this, in a way, this yokai, this what seems to be like a negative creature, is turning into more godlike or an object of worship that is, well, very much better position than a creature of just of no status. And this, they're I lost my train of thought.
Well, it's interesting, but it's interesting that that's happening in a modern way, right? I mean, because yokai are very, very old.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in a modern time where we would say not only are we scientific rational beings, but we're dealing with a scientific problem, a science problem of COVID. What do? You resurrect a yokai and you say it's that one.
Yeah, and there's more I think it was in the Minpaku or the Museum, National Museum of Ethnology, or there are events or exhibition where local schools, local elementary schools hosted or asked their students to draw their own yokai. And many a time, though these yokais are oftentimes digitally inclined. Sometimes one, I think one of the yokai that I remember from that small short clip was that if I forgot what's the name, but if a person were to stare at the screen too much, the yokai will somehow ruin your eye. And that's basically a yokai way of telling, hey, don't look at the sun, don't stare at the screen too long, or else you'll have your eye, have you losing an eyesight ultimately. That kind of modern interpretation of yokai or folk monsters, folk creatures.
Well, and it just says something I think about the human condition, right? There's always something we're going to be fearful of.
Yeah.
And we can assign a yokai to something we're fearful of, whether that's disease, pandemic, war, technology, right? The human condition is we make a story.
And a very fun, what Michael said, very fun communication.
Yeah. I don't want to cut you off because...
I have no idea what the original question
was. So just an old and new myth. So in this context, you
Shinto
have
and Buddhist and
the sort of old native religion in Japan being kind of competed with this new myth of Buddhism. So what does that mean maybe for us now?
Do you have any notes you want to give on that story before we... Sometimes you do. If you do, that's fine.
Maybe nothing in particular. I mean, I'd just say, going back to, my experience in Japan, I did a few pilgrimages the last time that I was there and visited, probably all in all a little over 100 temples. And you always see Jizo everywhere because of this idea of Jizo being able to go into hell and, if your relative was not a very good person, you can always appeal to Jizo to ease their suffering somehow. And so people will donate these statues of Jizo to the temple, so often you see hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of them in some of the bigger temples. So it's quite striking.
Yep, very important. So one of the things that I noticed about this, and I'm going to ask you two about it, is the human condition is such that we always wonder what happens after we die. And it's such a huge part of any spiritual practice to sort of consider questions about what is my life about in the physical realm, and then where do we go after we die? So what do the two of you think this story helps us to perhaps understand about life and death. I mean, those are big questions, right? Our actions in life and what they perhaps mean after we're gone from the physical realm. Of course, in our particular tradition, we have this long history of karma, which not every spiritual tradition has. All of these things are sort of bound up in this story. So what strikes the two of you about this that you would want to pull out for us and make sure we think about or understand?
I'm currently subscribed to Michael's how stories are this communicative tool, and this story that Doju gave us is also another form of a communication or communicative tool, and because like it has a seal of approval that it's a true story, it shows like, hey, following like cultivating good karma, try to avoid bad karma, then leads to a better afterlife. And if for some reason you somehow sinned, intentionally or unintentionally, now that's a whole hurdle story of like what's the intentional sin or what's not. But if they were to commit some kind of sin, let's hope that Jesus will save you from the depth of hell. And like I said, the true story over here is like showing that, hey, do good, try not to do bad, and then your afterlife is that will not be painful. So that's the
It really sort of makes it personal, right? I mean, we can go through the world, moving through the world as bodhisattvas and thinking that's important, but not really having some tangible feedback about that. And this story sort of says, this is very much about what's going to happen to you personally.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just about putting good in the world, it's about, in this case, it's going to happen to you personally.
Yeah, it's like a person like flaming to you, like, hey, this what was his name? Kamo?
The person's name in the story, Moritaka?
Moritaka.
Yeah, Moritaka is you, and
Yeah, yes, exactly.
you better follow not do what he done, or let's hope for Jesus to help you. Kind of like it's really a personalized story.
Yeah.
If replacing the lead what was his name again?
Moritaka.
With the leader.
Right, well, what's interesting, so when you say that, that makes me think, in both of these stories that Doju has read, there is someone at the center of that we, I think, are expected to identify with, who is not the powerful priest, who is not the bodhisattva, who is a normal human being, who's trying to do something, build a pagoda, live his life, stay out of hell, right? And so these stories are really a way for us to identify with a character, I think, and say, this could happen to me, all right, if I don't if I make the same mistakes as this character, something will happen to me. Or if I do the same virtuous things as this character, right, something will happen to me.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
And indirectly connecting with any of the bodhisattva that appeared in those stories. Like, oh, if I were to do something like this, maybe I can gain the favor of the said bodhisattva.
Right.
So like, best to do cultivate those.
And it kind of makes that bodhisattva real in
Yeah,
a certain way, right? We might kind of think, well, they're figures of our imagination, but when we see them in the story, you might think, well, there's some.
Makes your
reality.
hand smell good.
It makes your hand smell good forever and ever. The cheese on your hand. I don't want to cut off Michael because I think you also had some things.
Well, I'm just going to say that this is a true story, and the important point is that whether the story is true or not is does it reveal something about the depth of life, and does it provide a connection? And if it does, then it's a true story. If it simply is an exercise in make-believe, then it's an exercise in make-believe. And Andy and I were talking about the fact that, and this is a very common perception, of course, everybody knows today that a myth is a lie, right? A myth is make-believe. No. A myth, a story, is a vehicle, potentially, for delivering us to a deeper place. It's a vehicle for delivering us beyond the rational and the scientific, in one sense, the rational scientific, into something that is true at a deep level. And so it's important for all of us to live out of true stories, however they show up. And as we examine the stories out of which we do live, the question we have to continually ask ourselves is, does this story I'm telling myself about X, is it grounded in deepest reality? Or is it grounded in my fantasies about the way I really would rather life be? Or is it a reflection of the way life actually is? So,
Which is a teaching we hear all the time, right? Not to get caught up in our own sort of deluded thinking. So I'm glad you got to what is a true story. We didn't have time, I didn't have time to get there, but I'm glad you brought it up because I think that's one of the things that's useful about this, right? So, given the time, what I want to do, I'm going to deviate slightly from the schedule. What I want to do is throw it open to whatever comments, questions want to come from the group, and then before we close, I'm going to ask Doju to read his final story so that we can respond and react to that a little bit. Please.
One, as I listened to some of the different points brought up, and we can all look at myths and fables as a way to communicate something that's culturally relevant to the authors of the story. It may be something they believe is true, or they wish to believe is true, or how they think people should behave in society. I think another way to look at myths is also a form of competition. You touched on it a little bit with that one story of the Lotus Sutras, about the Buddhism versus Shintoism, and they're trying to demonstrate one is better than the other. A few years back I read through the Lotus Sutra and I found it hard to connect with. But one thing that really came out of it is that it was in many places came across as a very strong what's the word, polemic, basically saying, hey, this is right, this is really, it's like they're trying to convince people, not this, but this, and it was filled with all these stories. And to bring this maybe a little bit forward to something you said about Joseph Campbell, he said we're living between the old myth and the new myth, and I think right now, this very day, every day you turn on the TV, you see a competition of myths. You will, if you turn on to one channel, one series of commentators, they'll be saying things, and you'll say, how in the world can people actually believe that? And you turn on another channel and it says, yeah, that's what I believe. And like they're two different parallel worlds coexisting, building their own myths in this competition to see who is going to win.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that pattern has been around for so long. It's been around for more than 1,000 years because we know stories were used to prove my temple is more important, more powerful, my teacher is a better teacher than the next one. Why? In order to gain support, gain credibility, and we're still using stories in that way, right?
Adding on to that, there another yokai fact. There is a wind or wind goblin, I would say, for lack of a better term, called the Tengu, with long nose that has with a Tolkien, and it's the avatar is very clearly a mountain ascetic, or at least some denomination of Buddhism, and these Tengu creatures are considered to be like a characterized version of the heretic of different Buddhist denomination. So if a one Buddhist denomination points out that, hey, this denomination, let's say Nichiren is doing the bad Buddhism, that means all those followers are Tengus. They are too high nose, meaning that hanaga takai, which means like they're too haughty, they're too proud, or they're practicing the demon way, so therefore they're not considered a monk or they're just degraded. They just downgraded into a non-human, but not a Buddha, but a yokai-like monster. So there is this a competition of different denomination, and the product or a story of that creates this that validates, is that what? Or that what's the word that validates or that proves that this denomination is bad and we are good. So therefore, if you don't want to become
validate.
and if you don't want to become a Tengu, join our
Don't be a Tengu.
denomination. That kind of narrative is quite common. So.
Interesting, and you wouldn't, we kind of think, oh, we're peaceful Buddhists, we don't argue with anybody, right? Historically, it's not been the case, right? Other comments about what Andrew's bringing up, or other things from today? Neil, please.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the various political functions like stories could serve, but I really liked Michael's point about the truth of stories and myths, because the policies are interesting, but I'm thinking about what can I take from a story that might be useful. And I think too often my own habit, maybe our habit today, is to think that to be true means literally true, and that can be misleading. I remember seeing an abstract for a paper where researchers were looking at stories about advanced practitioners in a tradition where after death their bodies wouldn't decompose, they were immune to decomposition. So they were doing a study where they had careful measurements, and they were doing the springiness of a practitioner who had transitioned to this state, and it looked like his body had held up for a long time. And I think that I worried that there was a sense it's not really valuable unless it's literally true. And so I worried about that, discounting something. But then I also worried that if one took some of these stories to be literally true, that then that could lead one to act in ways that could be counterproductive. Not that one in particular, I'm not too worried about. I guess, yeah. But in other domains. And so, yeah, I like that distinction between truth and literal truth.
So you can see why we're coming back to stories again this year, to continue to talk about questions like that, right? Because one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, as practitioners, what is the value of hearing a story that's 1,000 years old, that came out of a country that's across the world? We have different circumstances today, so what's the use of that? And yet these are really an important part of our tradition, right? And we kind of have to know, I think, we have to know something about tale literature in general when we approach, for instance, stories about Dogen, because we need to see that those were not isolated pieces of literature, right? They are very much part of a vernacular tradition which was used to legitimize things and talks about powerful teachers in a certain way. And we read these stories about Dogen that said he copied an entire major manuscript in one night because a deity came to help him, and we don't think that probably literally happened. And yet, because it's Dogen, we go, oh, that must be important. Well, if that was a story about somebody, that Doju had just read in the Tales of the Lotus Sutra, we would go, yeah, that's nice, but. So there's something about that in our tradition. What does that mean for us, right? These are questions we sort of need to think about. So that story about Dogen is supposed to communicate something to us, and we accept it because there are certain characters in it, but that format, as we see, is not unusual. So I think having that broader context is important. So what is true? And what does that mean? And I think it's interesting the way Michael characterized that. What is true? There's some truth about life in it. Is it literally true? Perhaps not, but there's something there we go, yeah, there's something important there for me. You had a follow-up.
Sorry, that story about Dogen just reminded me that in the conversation, I was thinking of a story that might be in one of Sawaki's commentaries where he talks about how he was practicing somewhere and he was sitting zazen, and it was just so intense that someone came into the room, and the fierceness of it just startled them. They were so frightened they dropped into prostration, and it's interesting to think, as a scientist, I think what would it have looked like if I were there,
right?
Which is one question, but it is important to think what's the point, right,
Sure.
of that relating that story.
And then you have to take these the way you would take any piece of literature. Who is the audience?
Mm-hmm.
Who is telling the story? What when you're doing folklore, I'm sure you're looking at where was that story coming from? Who was telling it? Who was it directed to? and what was the circumstance of that. Sometimes the very format that gets used has something, it shifts something about the meaning, because remember the format of Asian vernacular literature is really important to what it means, right? So all this stuff we can really dig into. So on the one hand, we can simply enjoy the story and take, what we take from that. On the other hand, if we really want to dig into what these stories mean, there are many, talk about multiple layers. Many layers. I mean, look at the things that Doju has pointed out in that first story that we wouldn't have picked up if we didn't understand that context, right? There's just so much to chew on. I need to stop talking. What would other people like to say about what Neil is bringing up, things that our guests have brought up, other things that have struck you tonight? Sagan, please.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing if Campbell suggested how long it might be before a new myth develops.
Interesting.
Did he say anything about how long that might take? Or anything?
I believe not. I think reality took him out before anything else could evolve. But and part of what I think I would find helpful is to consider that we're here thinking about how does what's the role of story in Buddhism. And the question that I think might be most helpful in terms of getting us to a new myth package is to think about the role of Buddhism in story. In other words, the Buddha did not create Buddhism. The Buddha was a teacher of his attempt to communicate the deep realities that Shakyamuni had experienced, and of course he was then forced to try to communicate that. And of course there were some nerds in the corner who were taking notes, and sometime after his death, 800-900 of them got together and sort of shared stories and accounts, and somewhere out of that, Buddhism showed up. Well, and it as a story, as a certain take, and of course, and then you had this version, and this version, and this version, and this version, as human beings like to do. So the question today, as we consider for ourselves, what are the deep realities that this story, story of Zazen has awakened in me? How do we now take that and here's the thing. We create our myths, and then our myths come back and create us. That's the way it works. And so it's important to so that we're not just doing ritual. Why do we do this ritual? Well, this is what you do. We've always done this. Why do we? What's that particular word mean? What's that particular poetry mean? Why it's special. Well, okay, maybe. And so in this moment, it's important, whatever our belief structure, whatever our practice, it's important to say, okay, how do I tell a story that can communicate with a 12-year-old today? And go try it out on your grandson, your niece, your nephew, your next door neighbor. See what you get. And that's when the evolution begins. I was, some time ago, I was teaching courses on with the traditional religious context. You know, and I have 8, 10, if I worked really hard, maybe I get 12 people to show up. And then same marketing to the same audience. For some reason, I decided to, we're going to do a course on Joseph Campbell and myth. 80 people signed up immediately. And it began to get clear to me that the traditional packages weren't working so well. But the hunger was there, and it's still there. And certainly we can take the political situation or anything else and analyze it from that perspective. But for better or for worse, most of us, and I'm not certainly, much of society is just living up here on the surface of life. And of course, it's in the depth that we find the connection. It's in the depth that we find our commonness, and we need a way to access that today. And certainly this group, as much as any group in Bloomington, have some clues about how to do that. And but figuring out how to package that message is once again the key.
Yeah, which is interesting and makes me think that my felt need to expand our practice vision so that it looks a little bit broader. I think what I was doing was acting on some impression that people were looking for something, and that there were some gaps and there was some need, and that focusing only on activities was maybe not, it was too narrow a view. Right? So what is the common thing? So when we look at things like the 5 elements of spiritual health, or we look at, there's like some basic questions when it comes to a spiritual tradition, right? We're looking to answer some basic questions, like what happens after I die? What's my connection to something bigger than me? Where do I go when times are tough? How do I keep some equanimity? What does peace look like? Right? So our practices are wonderful practices, and if we put them in the context of the entire human experience, I think we speak to people differently. It's not a spiritual technology, which we often hear people want to use Zazen as a spiritual technology. I want to use it to make me feel better, or stop procrastinating, or be more productive, or manage my stress, right? But if we look at it in the broader context of what is the human experience, kind of a spiritual experience, we speak to people differently. So that's interesting. I'm also just going to parking lot for myself your connection between ritual and story. I think we need to investigate that, just in life, right? I want to ask Doju to read his last story so that we can also include that in the conversation. And when we feel like we've said everything we want to say, we're going to go have some wonderful dessert and continue our conversation, perhaps in smaller groups. But I want to, because I asked him to choose from 3 different collections, I want to make sure we include your last story from Kanon.
Sure. Today. Yes. And this one was kind of special for me in a way because.
Yes, please tell about that.
So this collection is specifically about the kanon of a particular temple, Waseda, which is in Nara. But I saw that name and I was like, that sounds really familiar, because there's also a Waseda in Kamakura, which is near Tokyo. It's a very popular day trip from Tokyo if you ever visit there. I went to that temple and I was like, I wonder if they're related somehow. And sure enough, there's a myth that the Waseda in Nara, they were carving the kanon statue for it. But the piece of wood that they had selected was so huge that it was enough for the guy to make 2 images. So they made one for this temple in Nara, and then they threw the other one in the ocean for it to find a place with which it had a karmic connection. And it's said that it drifted to Kamakura and washed up on the shore, and they built a temple right where it showed up, and that's the Waseda in Kamakura. And it was actually one of the most impressive images I saw. I did a pilgrimage that was a 34 kanon pilgrimage, so I saw a lot of kanon images. This was not on that pilgrimage. It's on a different pilgrimage that I didn't do, but it was huge. It was like a 50-foot tall piece of massive wood, all encrusted encrusted with gold leaf and so forth, and tons of people coming to see it. It was a very popular place to go. And I really enjoyed it. It's like up in Kamakura. It's sort of a popular surfing spot. Actually, it's nice. It's right on the beach, and it's like up on the side of a hill, so you have this view over the beach. It's a very beautiful temple if you ever get a chance to go there. So, anyways, this one is called "How the Great Holy One Caused the Theft of a Silk Robe in Order to Benefit a Man and Two Women." So during the time of the retired Emperor Toba, a poor woman entered the service of Lord Nagasane, Minister of the Left. So they have all these titles for the old court system in Japan, Minister of the Left being one. Although an inexperienced young woman, she had a good mind and served him faithfully, but she soon realized that such an ordinary position would not bring her lifelong security. Deeply concerned for her future, the woman had decided to make a monthly pilgrimage to the Hasedera and pray to the Kanon for her future welfare. Although this was the third winter since she had begun the visits to the temple, no sign of a blessing had yet granted her by the Kanon. She became more and more impoverished and possessed fewer and fewer things. As is the custom in this merciless world, people began to treat her with less respect owing to her reduced status. She thought that there might be good reason for this, and so she determined anew to rectify her attitude and pray to the Kanon for help. About the 10th day of the 12th month of Tenne, she cleansed her heart from sin and went to the Hasedera and confined herself there. Thinking that this was her last opportunity to receive the assistance of the Kanon, who shows great mercy even to plants and trees of the forest, she devoted herself to ascetic practices day and night. After she had fallen asleep one night while lamenting her helpless condition, a dignified old priest appeared to her in a dream and said, "I have taken pity on you. The sins of your previous existence were so grave that they have hindered your prayers. However, you may share the great mercy of this temple's Kanon, since you have been accumulating merit for so long. Take the robe of the lady who is behind you, then get up and return home quickly." The poor woman awoke and thought, "What a wretched idea! What good would it do for me to take a single silk robe?" She then fell asleep again, but dreamed that the same priest appeared again and insisted that she should take the robe. She felt that such a deed was truly shameful, yet realizing that this might be a device of the Great Holy One, she stealthily took the lady's silk robe, quickly put it on, and started through the darkness in excitement and confusion. As the woman reached the Jion temple by the lower reaches of the river Hatsuse, she heard the clamor of mounted men approaching behind her. Overwhelmed by fear and excitement, she devoutly relied on the Kanon. Then she heard one of the men give his attendant a message for her. The attendant ran over to her and gave her this message from the master. "Don't be afraid of us. While we were riding, we saw a lady walking ahead, and we thought that someone wearing a silk robe like yours must be a lady of a certain family returning home at this time of night after a private visit to the Hasedera. We will escort you until daybreak." Although frightened, the woman placed her entire trust in the Kanon. As dawn approached, they were able to see each other more clearly. The master was surprised at the woman's resemblance to his beloved wife, who had fallen sick and passed away. Overwhelmed by his sentimental feelings, the man told her, "Recently I lost my dear one, and I am now returning from the Hasedera, which I visited to obtain consolation. Meeting you must truly be the wish of the Great Holy One, and in the future I will devote myself entirely to its will." With these words, he continued to accompany the woman. The wealthy master was widely known as Minamoto no Yorimasa, and he lived in the Motosu district of Mino. He soon took the woman into his home, and they spent their months and years together in perfect harmony. But in the meantime, he had to move from the countryside to the capital, and he told the woman, "You will feel helpless and lonely remaining here alone, and your prospects are not promising. Is there anyone you know well in the capital? How would you like to come and find out where they're living?" How would you like to come and find out where they're living? The woman was reluctant to tell the master that she had no acquaintances in the capital at all, and so she said, "As a matter of fact, I have an elder sister there. Let us go to the capital." The master purchased various gifts for her elder sister, and they began their journey. After their arrival, the woman began to worry about what she had said so carelessly, for if the truth came out, she would surely be in trouble. Besides, she feared the judgment of the Buddha. "Oh, what a silly mood made me say a thing like that," she thought, as she regretted what she had said. And while lamenting about this matter along the way, she felt quite distraught. When they came to the Sanjo Bridge, she said to her master, "Please wait a moment, I will make an inquiry at that house." She saw there a quiet old house, which had a middle gate and space for carriages. The residence possessed a serene atmosphere, as though it belonged to a person of high rank. The woman asked a maidservant of the house if her mistress was in. When the maid said that she was, the woman told her to ask her mistress to come out so that she might meet and talk with her. Soon a lady about 40 years of age, whose appearance was beyond all criticism, appeared from a corner door of the house and asked the woman who she was. The woman explained her awkward situation and implored the assistance of the lady. "This is very difficult to ask, but would you kindly allow me to tell my master that this is where my elder sister lives? Would you mind very much?" she asked. "No, I don't mind at all," replied the lady. "Tell me more about yourself." And she invited the woman into the house. The woman was very pleased and offered the lady the various gifts that she had brought. The lady hesitated but accepted them and asked the woman why she was doing this. The woman began telling her the whole story, beginning with the incident at the Waseda. The lady was very surprised by her story and exclaimed, "What a miraculous coincidence! I am the person who lost her silk robe that night in the Waseda. My husband, Fujiwara no Toshitsugu, the former provincial governor of Iga, had passed away, and my financial support and rice allowance as his widow were very limited compared to my wardrobe expenses. Since I had neither children nor other sources of support, I was making a pilgrimage, unworthy as I was, to the Waseda to pray for the assistance of the Kanon. Yet I received no blessing, and to make the situation even worse, my robe was stolen. Since then, I have been grieving over the sadness and transiency of this life. I no longer go out and have been spending my days aimlessly. My fortunes were waning, and as I was alone, I was worried about the future. But now I receive all these precious gifts from you. For a moment it felt strange, but now I see that this is truly the thoughtful consideration of the Kanon. I am so overwhelmed that I cannot withhold my tears." The woman also was greatly moved by the lady's story and could not help weeping. The lady then said, "What is past is past. From now on, let us be devoted sisters." The woman thought that her master should know about this, and so she told him everything. He too was deeply impressed by the divine deeds of the Holy One, and looked after both of the women. He also settled the financial problems relating to the widow's estate. Thus, all three persons were benefited by the great merciful one, and their needs were satisfied. How truly remarkable this is.
So it isn't enough to save one person.
And then don't they say, and they lived happily ever
Ever
after?
after, that's right.
There's also a story based off on two events.
Of course it's a true, this has to be true. Comments from anybody on this story that Doju has just read?
Stealing is good if it's very benefit everybody.
Yes.
Thieving is okay if everybody wins.
I like that the story justifies stealing and lying.
Yeah.
Wait till King Emma was sure about that.
Yes. No bad karma comes from that.
As long as Conrad tells you.
Conrad is telling you it's okay, that's right, that's right. Last comments, reflections, things to share with the group. Are we good for the moment? All right. Let's give thanks to our guests. Thank you.